My wife didn't come here to leave you, Frank. She came here to replace you. Those were the first words my boss spoke as he stood behind my wife, smiling while she slid divorce papers across the break room table in front of half the warehouse. I didn't shout. I didn't beg. I didn't even ask why the man who had spent 3 years humiliating me at work was standing beside the woman I'd been married to for 24 years. I simply looked at both of them, signed the papers, and walked away. They thought they had just ended my life. Neither of them knew that within 90 days, one boardroom meeting would erase everything they had spent years building together. Before I tell you how that happened, I'd like to ask one small favor. If you enjoy emotional family dramas filled with betrayal, hidden truths, patient revenge, and satisfying justice, please subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. Your support truly helps stories like this reach more people. My name is Frank Holloway. I was 52 years old, worked as a warehouse floor supervisor for Hardwick Distribution, and until that Monday afternoon, I believed the worst thing that could happen to a man was discovering his marriage had quietly died while he was busy trying to provide for it. I had spent 11 years lifting freight, processing inventory, covering overtime shifts, and convincing myself that patience always paid off. Sandra used to tell me those long hours were temporary. We were saving for a better future. A larger house, real vacations, less worrying about every unexpected bill. Somewhere along the way, I kept working toward that future, while she quietly stopped believing it would ever arrive. The vending machine had just stolen $4 from me. I know that sounds ridiculous compared with everything that followed, but strange details become unforgettable on the worst days of your life. I stood staring at the blinking error code, wondering whether I cared enough to argue with building maintenance over a sandwich, when I heard expensive heels crossing the break room floor. Sandra never wore heels on weekdays. She always said they hurt too much after grocery shopping or running errands. The woman walking toward me sounded like someone else entirely. When I turned around, I barely recognized her. She wore a tailored gray blazer I'd never seen before. Her hair was styled the way she usually reserved for weddings or holiday parties. In her left hand was a thick manila envelope. Her face looked calm, but it wasn't the peaceful kind of calm. It was the calm of someone who had rehearsed this moment over and over until every emotion had been removed from it. Then I noticed she wasn't alone. Leaning casually against the break room doorway stood Craig Denton, the operations manager who had made my working life miserable for the past 3 years. Craig never needed to raise his voice to humiliate people. He preferred smiling while taking credit for someone else's work, denying promotion opportunities with carefully chosen excuses, or calling grown men buddy in a tone that somehow made the word sound like an insult. Seeing him standing behind my wife told me everything before either of them spoke a single sentence. Sandra slowly placed the envelope on the table between us. "Frank," she said quietly, "we need to do this today." I looked down at the envelope without touching it. "Do what?" She folded her arms. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." I opened the envelope. Petition for dissolution of marriage. My full legal name. The county seal. My wife's signature. The filing date stopped me cold. It had been signed 2 weeks earlier. She hadn't decided to leave me today. She had already been carrying the decision around for 14 days while eating dinner across from me every evening and asking whether I wanted more coffee. Around us, the entire break room fell silent. 2 employees pretended to scroll through their phones. Pete Akers, the closest friend I'd made during 11 years at Hardwick, stared at the floor because he couldn't bear to watch. Craig remained at the doorway wearing the confident smile of a man convinced the story had already ended exactly the way he wanted. Sandra broke the silence first. "I'm tired of waiting for a life that's never coming, Frank." I looked from her to Craig, then back again. "You're leaving me for him." It wasn't really a question. She didn't deny it. She didn't apologize. She simply said, "I deserve more than this." I studied her face for several long seconds, picked up the pen lying beside the coffee machine, turned to the final page, and quietly signed every document without reading another word. Sandra blinked. Craig's smile faded just enough for me to notice. They had prepared themselves for anger, tears, and humiliation. They weren't prepared for silence. I slid the papers back across the table, looked directly at both of them, and said the last sentence either one expected to hear. I hope the two of you get exactly what you've chosen. Then I picked up my worn canvas bag, pressed the vending machine's coin return button one final time, and walked out of the break room, believing I had just lost everything. I had no idea that waiting inside my mailbox was a single unopened letter that would change all of our lives forever. I drove home with both hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my fingers ached. The farther I got from the warehouse, the quieter my thoughts became. I wasn't replaying the divorce papers anymore. I wasn't even thinking about Craig standing behind Sandra with that smug smile. I kept asking myself one simple question. At what point had my marriage actually ended? Was it 2 weeks ago when she signed the petition? 6 months ago when she stopped asking about my day? Or years earlier while I was working overtime, believing I was building a better future for both of us? By the time I pulled into the driveway, the answer no longer mattered. The house looked exactly the same from the outside, but the moment I opened the front door, I knew nothing inside would ever feel familiar again. Silence filled every room. Sandra's favorite reading chair was gone. The framed vacation photographs had disappeared from the hallway walls. The decorative shelves she insisted on buying every Christmas had vanished, leaving pale rectangles where sunlight had never touched the paint. She hadn't packed in a hurry. She had dismantled our life piece by piece while I was loading trucks and covering extra shifts, making sure I noticed nothing until the day she decided I no longer deserved an explanation. I walked upstairs. Her side of the closet stood almost empty, except for a single wire hanger swinging gently as the air conditioner turned on. The bathroom cabinet held nothing, except an old bottle of hand lotion she'd always complained about throwing away. 24 years of marriage had been reduced to a few forgotten objects nobody considered worth taking. Back downstairs, I found one final reminder waiting on the kitchen counter. A house key rested beside a folded yellow note. I recognized Sandra's handwriting immediately. The mortgage is due next week. Don't call me. This is what's best for both of us. That was all she left behind. No apology. No explanation. Just instructions. I folded the note, slipped it into my pocket, and laughed quietly to myself. It wasn't the laugh of someone finding humor. It was the sound a man makes when disappointment grows too heavy to carry any other way. I made a pot of coffee even though it was nearly 6 in the evening. The familiar routine gave my hands something to do while my mind struggled to catch up with reality. Sitting alone at the kitchen table, I noticed a stack of unopened mail Sandra had ignored before leaving. Normally, she sorted every envelope the day it arrived. Bills on one side, advertisements on the other. Important letters placed where neither of us could miss them. Tonight, everything remained untouched. I began opening them one by one. Utility bill, insurance statement, credit card balance. Then I reached a thick, cream-colored envelope, unlike anything else in the pile. The paper felt expensive. My full legal name, Frank Raymond Holloway, was typed across the front, in elegant black lettering, a name almost nobody ever used. The return address belonged to a law firm downtown. I frowned, unable to remember ever doing business with attorneys. Curious, I carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. The very first sentence stopped me cold. Dear Mr. Holloway, we regret to inform you of the passing of your uncle, Raymond Dale Holloway. I stared at the page for several seconds. Uncle Raymond was almost a stranger. I had met him only once, more than 20 years earlier, at my mother's funeral. I remembered a firm handshake, a quiet man in a dark suit, and an envelope containing $5,000. He insisted I accept before disappearing from my life without another word. Since then, nothing. No birthday cards, no phone calls, no family gatherings. I kept reading. The next paragraph made even less sense. In accordance with Mr. Holloway's final estate documents, you have been named the sole beneficiary of his estate. We respectfully request your presence at our office at your earliest convenience. I read the sentence again, convinced I had misunderstood it. Sole beneficiary? There had to be a mistake. Raymond barely knew me. He certainly didn't know me well enough to leave me anything important. I folded the letter carefully, placed it back inside the envelope, and set it on the kitchen table beside my untouched coffee. Earlier that afternoon, I had walked out of a warehouse believing my life had completely fallen apart. I had no way of knowing that one meeting with a lawyer the following morning would reveal a truth so extraordinary it would make everything that happened in that break room seem almost insignificant. I hardly slept that night. The letter remained on the kitchen table long after midnight, while I sat across from it with a cup of cold coffee, trying to convince myself it had been mailed to the wrong Frank Holloway. Uncle Raymond had always been a mystery. My father never spoke about him, and whenever I asked why they had stopped seeing each other, my mother simply said, "Some brothers lose each other long before they stop breathing." That was all I knew. Nothing about that quiet, distant man suggested he possessed an estate worth discussing, much less one important enough to require lawyers and formal appointments. Still, curiosity pulled me out of bed before sunrise. I put on the only navy blue suit I owned, one I had worn exactly twice in the last decade, locked the house behind me, and drove downtown. Marsh, Ellison, and Burke occupied the top 2 floors of a glass office tower overlooking the river. The receptionist greeted me by name before I introduced myself, confirming that I wasn't there by mistake. A few minutes later, an elderly attorney with silver hair entered the waiting room and extended his hand. "Mr. Holloway, I'm Gerald Marsh. Raymond spoke about you far more often than you probably realize." I frowned as we walked toward a large conference room. "That's impossible," I replied. I barely knew the man. Gerald offered a sympathetic smile. That wasn't by his choice. Those words lingered in my mind as he closed the conference room door and placed a thick leather folder on the polished table. He began with family records, explaining that my father and Raymond had argued over the sale of their parents' farm nearly 30 years earlier. The disagreement had grown into years of silence, and although Raymond repeatedly tried to reconnect, my father refused every letter and every phone call. After my parents passed away, Raymond hired investigators to locate me, but by then I had already moved several times chasing work. "He followed your life from a distance," Gerald said quietly. "He knew when you married Sandra. He knew you worked in logistics. He even knew you never stopped paying your bills, despite the difficult years after the recession." I sat speechless. A man I remembered only as a stranger had apparently spent decades watching over me without ever stepping into my life. Gerald finally opened the leather folder and slid several documents across the table. "Your uncle never had children," he said. 6 years ago, he rewrote his estate. He named you his sole beneficiary." I nodded politely, still expecting to inherit an old house, perhaps a modest investment account, or a small savings fund. Gerald adjusted his glasses before speaking again. "Mr. Holloway, before we continue, I need to ask whether you're familiar with a company called Holloway Industrial Holdings." I shook my head. "Never heard of it." He turned the first document toward me. At the top was a corporate logo, followed by financial statements that stretched across several pages. "Your uncle founded this holding company 41 years ago. Over time, it acquired manufacturing businesses, transportation firms, logistics companies, commercial real estate, and investment partnerships throughout the eastern United States." I looked at him blankly. None of it meant anything to me. Then he placed one final document in front of me. It contained a single number printed in bold type. Estimated estate value, $472,860,000. I stared at the page until the digits began to blur. "There has to be a mistake," I whispered. Gerald calmly shook his head. "There isn't." He opened another folder, showing corporate ownership charts. More importantly, the estate includes 63% of the voting shares in Holloway Industrial Holdings. He paused long enough for me to absorb what he was saying. "And Holloway Industrial Holdings owns the parent corporation of Hardwick Distribution?" My heartbeat seemed to stop completely. "You mean the warehouse where I work?" Gerald nodded once. "Not only the warehouse, Mr. Holloway. Effective immediately, you are the controlling owner of the entire company, including every executive currently employed there." My thoughts jumped instantly to Craig Denton standing in that break room with his arm around Sandra only 24 hours earlier. The man who believed he had humiliated a powerless warehouse supervisor had absolutely no idea who now owned the building he walked into every morning. Gerald smiled gently, before sliding one final document toward me. "The board doesn't know yet. The decision is yours. You can assume control today, or wait until you're ready." I looked down at the papers, then slowly folded my hands together. For the first time since Sandra handed me those divorce papers, I smiled. "No," I said quietly. "Let's give them 90 days. I want everyone to believe I'm still just Frank from the warehouse." When I left Gerald Marsh's office, I was one signature away from becoming the public owner of a corporation worth nearly $500 million. Instead, I drove straight back to the same small house Sandra had emptied the day before, changed out of my suit, pulled on my faded warehouse boots, and reported for my evening shift exactly on time. Nobody looked at me twice. That was precisely how I wanted it. Gerald had seemed surprised when I requested a 90-day delay before announcing the ownership transfer, but I already understood something that money couldn't buy. Power is most valuable when nobody realizes you have it. If Craig learned the truth immediately, he would destroy evidence, blame other people, and spend the next several months protecting himself. If Sandra discovered I had inherited Raymond's fortune, every word she had spoken in the break room would suddenly change. I didn't want apologies born from greed. I wanted the truth that only appears when people believe there are no consequences. The following morning, Gerald called to confirm the transition schedule. "The board has agreed to keep everything confidential," he explained. "Legally, you're already the controlling shareholder. Operationally, nothing changes until you decide otherwise." I thanked him and made one request. I want a complete, independent audit of every division in the company. Financial records, executive expenses, purchasing contracts, safety inspections, payroll practices, everything. I don't want anyone inside Hardwick choosing the auditors. Gerald didn't ask why. Consider it done. During the weeks that followed, my life became strangely divided into two completely different worlds. Every morning I attended confidential meetings with attorneys, accountants, and corporate advisors who addressed me as Mr. Holloway or Chairman. Every afternoon I changed into a reflective safety vest, scanned freight pallets, and listened while Craig barked orders across the warehouse floor as though nothing had changed. It became impossible not to notice details I had ignored for years. Forklifts overdue for maintenance continued operating because repair requests kept disappearing. Employees injured on the loading docks quietly returned to work before fully recovering because supervisors feared higher insurance claims. Overtime assignments somehow always favored Craig's closest friends, while the hardest workers struggled to receive enough hours to support their families. I had accepted these problems as ordinary workplace politics. Now I realized they formed a pattern. Every shortcut saved someone money. Every unfair decision benefited someone higher up the chain. One afternoon, I watched Pete Akers submit his fourth request for replacement safety harnesses after 2 older units failed inspection. Craig glanced at the paperwork, smirked, and tossed it into the trash. "We'll deal with it next quarter," he said without looking up from his phone. Pete quietly picked the form out of the garbage after Craig walked away and muttered, "One day somebody's going to die because of that man." He had no idea I was standing close enough to hear every word. That evening, I forwarded the incident directly to the independent audit team without using company email. 2 days later, they requested maintenance records for every warehouse in the region. The deeper they investigated, the more disturbing the reports became. Inflated vendor invoices. Equipment purchased but never delivered. Performance bonuses approved for executives, despite repeated safety violations. Expense accounts paying for luxury vacations disguised as business conferences. Every report carried the same name somewhere near the approval line, Craig Denton. Yet none of those discoveries surprised me as much as what happened one Friday afternoon. I returned from lunch early and stopped outside Craig's office after hearing familiar laughter through the partially open door. Sandra was inside. She wasn't dropping off paperwork or bringing him coffee. She walked confidently around his desk, kissed him without hesitation, and laughed as Craig wrapped his arms around her. 90 days, Craig whispered. "Once the divorce is final and I get the promotion, we'll never have to think about Frank again." Sandra smiled. "He'll spend the rest of his life loading trucks while we finally start living." Neither of them realized the quiet warehouse supervisor standing just outside the doorway, already owned the company they were planning to climb together. I walked away without making a sound, because their biggest mistake wasn't betraying me. Their biggest mistake was believing they still had 90 days left to win. Over the next several weeks, my routine never changed. I clocked in before sunrise, unloaded freight, signed inventory sheets, and accepted orders from men who had no idea I possessed the authority to fire every executive in the building with a single signature. Remaining invisible became my greatest advantage. People reveal their true character when they believe the quiet man in the corner has no power. Every Friday afternoon, Gerald Marsh called with another confidential audit report. Each one painted a darker picture than the last. What began as a financial review quickly uncovered a culture built on deception. Vendor contracts had been awarded to companies owned by Craig's college friends without competitive bidding. Warehouse maintenance budgets had been approved on paper, yet thousands of dollars worth of repairs had never been completed. Safety inspections had been signed off without anyone actually walking through the buildings. Employees risking their lives every day believed the company simply couldn't afford improvements. The truth was far uglier. Someone had decided profits mattered more than people. I asked Gerald only one question after every report. Can we prove it? His answer became more confident each week. Yes. I refused to act until every accusation could survive a courtroom. Revenge built on anger falls apart under scrutiny. Justice built on evidence doesn't. One Monday morning, that principle was tested. A forklift carrying nearly 2 tons of steel tubing suddenly lost hydraulic pressure only a few yards from where Pete Akers was working. The heavy load crashed onto the concrete floor with an explosion that echoed through the warehouse. Workers dove for cover as metal rolled in every direction. Pete escaped with only a bruised shoulder because he reacted quickly enough to jump behind a storage rack. Had he hesitated for one more second, the pipes would have crushed him. While paramedics checked the employees, Craig stormed across the warehouse, furious about only one thing. "Who shut production down?" he shouted. Nobody answered. He kicked one of the damaged pipes before pointing at the maintenance supervisor. "Get this cleaned up before corporate hears about it." I watched in disbelief. Not once did he ask whether everyone was alive. That afternoon, the independent auditors requested the forklift's maintenance history. The records revealed something astonishing. Pete's written repair request from 6 weeks earlier had never been processed. Craig himself had marked the equipment as safe, despite repeated warnings from maintenance staff. Gerald called me that evening. "Frank," he said quietly, "this is no longer just financial misconduct. We may be looking at criminal negligence." I closed my eyes for several seconds. Pete's words echoed through my memory. One day, somebody's going to die because of that man. He had been closer to the truth than either of us realized. Over the following days, more evidence surfaced. Craig had approved bonuses for himself while delaying mandatory equipment replacements. Expense reports disguised luxury golf weekends as executive safety conferences. Company credit cards had paid for expensive restaurants, hotel suites, and gifts completely unrelated to business. Even more disturbing, several invoices led investigators to a consulting company secretly owned by Sandra's brother. Hundreds of thousands of dollars had flowed through fake advisory contracts requiring almost no actual work. Sandra wasn't simply Craig's girlfriend. She had quietly become part of the financial scheme. For the first time since inheriting Raymond's company, I felt genuine disappointment instead of anger. Sandra hadn't left me because she wanted a different life. She had already chosen one built on lies long before she handed me those divorce papers. Gerald summarized the growing investigation in one sentence. "We have enough evidence to terminate Craig immediately." I leaned back in my chair and slowly shook my head. "Not yet," he paused. "Why wait?" I looked through the warehouse window where Craig stood laughing with several managers who still believed they were untouchable. "Because they still think they're winning," I answered quietly. "And people who believe they've already won always make one final mistake." 2 days later, my assistant forwarded the agenda for the next quarterly board meeting. Beside the date was one additional note written by Gerald himself. "All ownership transfer documents are complete. Approval for public announcement has been scheduled." I smiled for the first time in weeks. The 90 days were almost over, and Craig Denton was about to walk into a boardroom believing he was there to celebrate the biggest promotion of his career. The 90th morning began like every other workday. I woke before dawn, brewed a pot of coffee, ironed my old warehouse uniform, and stood in front of the closet for several seconds before quietly putting it back. Instead, I reached for the navy blue suit I had worn only once since Raymond's funeral. I tied my tie slowly, looked at my reflection, and almost laughed. 3 months earlier, I had walked into Gerald Marsh's office, believing I had lost everything. Today, I was about to walk into a boardroom where everyone else believed they had already won. At exactly 8 o'clock, a black sedan sent by the corporate office pulled into my driveway. The driver opened the rear door without saying a word. During the ride downtown, Gerald reviewed the agenda one final time. The board believes today's meeting is about approving next year's executive restructuring, he explained. Craig has no idea the ownership announcement is on the schedule. I nodded. Good. Let's keep it that way. When we arrived at Holloway Industrial Holdings headquarters, I entered through the executive entrance for the first time in my life. The receptionist greeted me with a respectful smile. Good morning, Mr. Holloway. Hearing those words still felt strange. Gerald led me into a private conference room beside the main boardroom, where several directors stood to shake my hand. They welcomed me warmly, but I asked only one question. Is every document ready? Gerald placed a thick leather folder in front of me. Ownership transfer, board resolutions, executive termination packets, forensic audit summaries, and legal notices. Everything has been reviewed and approved. I signed each page carefully, without rushing. Every signature represented months of patience, instead of minutes of anger. When the final document was complete, Gerald glanced at his watch. It's time. Through the glass wall, I could already see executives gathering inside the boardroom. Craig stood near the large presentation screen, laughing confidently with 2 vice presidents. Expensive tailored suit, gold cufflinks, the posture of a man expecting congratulations. Sandra sat quietly near the back of the room as Craig's invited guest. She looked elegant, relaxed, and completely certain she had chosen the right future. Neither of them noticed me watching through the tinted glass. Ready? Gerald asked. I took one slow breath. More than ever. The double doors opened. Conversation stopped almost immediately as Gerald entered first, followed by the board members. I walked in last. Craig looked toward the doorway, frowned slightly, then smirked. Frank, he said with an amused laugh, I think you're lost. Warehouse management meets in Building 3. Several executives smiled politely, assuming I had entered by mistake. Sandra's eyes widened with embarrassment. Frank, she whispered, this isn't the place for you. I ignored both of them and continued walking until I reached the empty chair at the head of the long mahogany table. Craig's smile disappeared. Excuse me, he said. That's the chairman's seat. Before I could answer, Gerald calmly stepped forward. Actually, Mr. Denton. He placed a leather folder in front of every board member before looking directly at Craig. That seat now belongs to Mr. Frank Holloway. Complete silence swept across the room. Craig blinked twice, waiting for someone to laugh. Nobody did. Sandra stared at me as though she had forgotten how to breathe. Gerald continued without raising his voice. As of this morning, following the completion of Raymond Holloway's estate transfer, Mr. Frank Holloway has become the controlling shareholder of Holloway Industrial Holdings, with 63% voting ownership. Effective immediately, he assumes the position of executive chairman of this corporation. One director slid the official ownership certificate across the table toward me. Gerald nodded respectfully. Congratulations, Mr. Chairman. Every eye in the room turned toward me. Craig's face had gone completely white. He looked from Gerald to the board members and finally back at me, desperately searching for some sign that this was an elaborate joke. No, he muttered. That's impossible. I slowly opened the leather folder in front of me. Inside rested the independent audit reports collected over the past 90 days. I looked directly at Craig and spoke for the first time since entering the room. 3 months ago, I said calmly, you stood behind my wife while she handed me divorce papers in the warehouse break room. You believed I was the smallest man in the company. I gently closed the folder and folded my hands on the table. This morning, Mr. Denton. We're finally going to discuss the company you've really been managing. Nobody spoke after my last sentence. Craig remained standing beside his chair, his confident smile completely gone. Around the table, directors quietly opened the audit binders Gerald had distributed moments earlier. The only sound in the room came from pages turning one after another. Craig tried forcing a laugh. "Frank, this has to be some misunderstanding." I looked directly at him. "For 11 years, I worked inside your company. For the last 90 days, I've been reviewing everything you did while believing no one was watching." Gerald rose from his seat and activated the large presentation screen behind him. The company logo disappeared, replaced by the title Independent Forensic Audit, Executive Review. Every executive in the room straightened in their chair. Craig's expression hardened. "What's the meaning of this?" Gerald calmly advanced to the first slide. Unauthorized vendor contracts totaling $8.7 million. Company names appeared beside payment histories, ownership records, and bank transfers. Several directors immediately recognized the pattern. "These companies all share the same mailing address," one board member observed. Gerald nodded. "Because they are controlled through relatives and business associates connected to Mr. Craig Denton," Craig immediately interrupted. "Those were approved consulting agreements." Gerald didn't even look at him. No measurable consulting services were ever delivered. The next slide appeared. Warehouse safety violations. Photographs of broken forklifts, expired safety harnesses, damaged loading equipment, and maintenance requests filled the screen. Every repair order carried the same digital approval signature. Craig Denton. Then came the incident report from the warehouse accident involving Pete Akers. Security camera footage showed the exact moment the hydraulic system failed, sending thousands of pounds of steel crashing onto the concrete floor only feet from where employees were working. The room became silent. Gerald enlarged one maintenance request dated 6 weeks before the accident. Pete had clearly written that the forklift should be removed from service immediately because of repeated hydraulic failures. The request had been rejected. Reason: budget not approved. Approval signature: Craig Denton. One elderly director slowly removed his glasses. "Someone could have died," Gerald answered quietly. "According to our investigators, they almost did." Craig's voice rose noticeably. "We were under pressure to reduce operating costs. Every executive in this room approved cost-saving measures. Before anyone else could respond, I opened another folder and slid it across the table toward the directors. "Reducing costs is one thing," I said calmly. "Using company money to finance your personal lifestyle is something else." Gerald clicked to the next slide. Luxury hotel invoices, 5-star restaurant receipts, Caribbean resort reservations, championship golf vacations, designer watches. Every expense had been submitted as executive business development. The total exceeded $1 million over 3 years. A low murmur spread through the boardroom. Craig's face turned pale. "Those expenses were authorized." "Not by the shareholders," one director replied coldly. Gerald continued without slowing down. "There is one final matter." The screen changed again. This time it displayed consulting agreements issued to Denton Strategic Solutions. The directors looked confused until Gerald enlarged the ownership records. The company wasn't owned by Craig. It was owned by Sandra's younger brother. Over $700,000 had been transferred through contracts requiring almost no documented work. Sandra suddenly stood up. "I had nothing to do with that." Gerald calmly held up several email exchanges bearing her name. "Mrs. Holloway, these communications show you personally recommended the consulting arrangement while employed as an outside contractor." Sandra slowly sat back down without another word. Craig realized everything was collapsing. "Frank," he said desperately, "whatever happened between us personally has nothing to do with the company. Don't make business decisions because of your divorce." I looked at him for several seconds before answering. "This meeting has nothing to do with my divorce." I rested my hand on the audit report. "If I wanted revenge, I would have fired you the day I inherited this company. Instead, I gave you 90 days. During those 90 days, you created enough evidence to convict yourself." I turned toward the directors. "Ladies and gentlemen, You've now seen the financial fraud, the safety violations, the misuse of shareholder funds, and the conflicts of interest. I believe you've seen enough. The chairman of the audit committee slowly closed his binder and looked around the table. I move that Craig Denton be terminated immediately for cause, that all executive access be revoked effective today, and that this entire investigation be referred to federal authorities and the state attorney general for further review. Before Craig could speak again, another director quietly said the words that ended his career forever. I second the motion. The vote was unanimous. 9 hands rose around the boardroom table without a single objection. Craig remained frozen where he stood, staring at the directors as though someone would suddenly laugh and admit the entire meeting had been an elaborate prank. Nobody did. The chairman quietly signed the termination resolution before sliding it across the table to me. I added my signature beneath his. 11 years after I first walked through the warehouse doors, wearing steel-toe boots and carrying a lunchbox, the man who had spent years reminding me how powerless I was no longer worked for the company. 2 security officers entered the boardroom a few moments later. They approached Craig politely, but professionally. "Mr. Denton," one of them said, "your access credentials have been disabled. We'll escort you while you collect your personal belongings." Craig looked at me one last time. The arrogance that had defined him for years had vanished completely. "Frank," he said quietly, "we can still fix this. You don't have to destroy everything." I calmly closed the audit folder. "Craig, I didn't destroy your career. You spent 3 years doing that yourself." I simply refused to look away. He opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. Every explanation had already been buried beneath contracts, emails, invoices, and maintenance records carrying his own signature. As the officers guided him toward the door, he suddenly turned toward Sandra. "Tell them," he pleaded. "Tell Frank we can work this out." Sandra didn't move. She sat motionless, staring at the ownership certificate lying in front of me. For several long seconds, she seemed unable to understand what had happened. Then she whispered the only question that truly mattered. You owned all of this?" I met her eyes for the first time since the meeting had begun. "Not when you left me," I answered honestly. "But I did before you decided to build a future with him." The color drained from her face. She replayed every decision she had made over the previous 3 months. The divorce papers. The humiliation in the break room. The night spent celebrating with Craig while believing they were climbing toward a better life. She had walked away from a man she considered ordinary, without ever realizing that his life had already changed forever. Tears slowly filled her eyes. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered. The room fell silent again. I thought about that question for several seconds before answering. "Because I needed to know why you were leaving." She frowned through her tears. I continued quietly. "If I had told you about Raymond's estate the day I found out, would you still have filed for divorce?" Sandra lowered her head. She didn't answer because she couldn't. We both already knew the truth. Money would have changed her decision, not her heart. I stood from my chair and walked toward the large windows, overlooking the city. "You told me you deserved a better life," I said without turning around. There was nothing wrong with wanting more. The problem was, believing integrity could be traded for comfort. Behind me, I heard Sandra quietly crying. For the first time in years, I didn't feel anger toward her, only sadness. 24 years together deserved a better ending than this. But endings are built from choices, not wishes. She slowly walked toward me, stopping only a few feet away. "Frank, I'm sorry." Her voice trembled. "I made the biggest mistake of my life." I nodded gently. "I believe you." Hope briefly appeared on her face. Then I continued. "But apologizing after the consequences arrive isn't the same as being faithful before they do." Her shoulders slumped as she finally understood there would be no second chance. The marriage had not ended because I became wealthy. It had ended the day she decided another man's promises were worth more than 24 years of loyalty. One of the board members quietly approached us. "Mr. Chairman," he said respectfully, "the press has gathered downstairs. They're waiting for a statement regarding today's executive changes." I thanked him and turned back toward Sandra. "Take care of yourself," I said calmly. "I sincerely hope you build the life you were looking for." She reached toward me, as though she wanted to say something else. But I had already begun walking toward the boardroom door. Behind me, I heard quiet sobbing echo through the room. In front of me waited dozens of reporters, thousands of employees searching for answers, and a company that deserved far better leadership than it had received for years. My story with Sandra was over. My responsibility to everyone else was only just beginning. The media coverage lasted for weeks. Every business newspaper across the state carried the same headline, in one form or another. Longtime executive removed, following internal fraud investigation. None of the articles mentioned the divorce papers in the warehouse break room. None of them described the years Craig spent humiliating employees, or the afternoon he stood behind my wife, believing he had already won. Those details no longer mattered. The evidence spoke for itself. Within days of the board meeting, state investigators arrived at corporate headquarters carrying boxes instead of briefcases. Computers were seized. Financial servers were copied. Executive emails dating back 7 years were placed under review. The forensic audit Gerald had quietly built over 3 months became the foundation for multiple civil lawsuits and a criminal investigation involving procurement fraud, corporate theft, falsified safety records, and misuse of shareholder funds. Craig hired expensive attorneys, but every defense collapsed beneath the weight of his own signatures. Every invoice, every approval, every deleted maintenance request had been preserved long before he realized anyone was looking. The confidence that once filled every room he entered disappeared behind courtroom doors and legal depositions. Sandra faced consequences of a different kind. Although investigators determined she had not directed the fraud, her involvement in recommending fraudulent consulting contracts exposed her to civil liability. More painful than the financial penalties was the reality that nobody trusted her anymore. Friends who once admired her quietly disappeared. The people who had celebrated her relationship with Craig stopped answering her calls after his career collapsed. The future she believed she had chosen vanished almost overnight. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she sold the luxury apartment she had shared with Craig less than 6 months after the investigation began. I wished her no harm. Regret was already punishing her more effectively than I ever could. My attention belonged somewhere else. During my first official month as executive chairman, I visited every warehouse owned by Holloway Industrial Holdings instead of remaining behind a desk. I spoke directly with forklift operators, shipping clerks, maintenance mechanics, receptionists, truck drivers, and janitorial staff. I asked every one of them the same question. If you could change one thing about this company tomorrow morning, what would it be? Their answers were remarkably consistent. Better equipment, honest supervisors, safer working conditions, opportunities to advance based on performance instead of personal connections. Nobody asked for luxury offices or expensive executive retreats. They simply wanted to feel respected. Within 90 days, we approved every delayed safety replacement Craig had rejected. Aging forklifts were retired. New protective equipment arrived at every warehouse. Anonymous reporting systems were installed, so employees could report misconduct without fear of retaliation. Promotions were reviewed by independent committees rather than individual managers. For the first time in years, people began believing that doing the right job actually mattered again. One Friday afternoon, I walked back into the same warehouse break room where Sandra had handed me the divorce papers. The old vending machine was still broken. Pete Akers laughed when he saw me staring at it. "Mr. Chairman," he said with a grin, "we've been meaning to replace that thing." I smiled. "Then let's stop meaning to." 3 days later, a brand new vending area was installed alongside new tables, better lighting, and upgraded employee facilities. It wasn't an expensive investment, but it represented something much larger. People notice when leadership finally starts keeping small promises. Before leaving that afternoon, Pete stopped me near the loading dock. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Sure." He hesitated for a moment. "When did you decide to get even with Craig?" I looked across the warehouse floor where dozens of employees were finishing their shifts safely, using equipment that should have been replaced years earlier. Then I quietly shook my head. I never wanted to get even. Pete looked surprised. I wanted to make sure nobody else ever had to work for someone like him again. As I walked toward the exit, I realized that was the difference between revenge and justice. Revenge ends when another person loses. Justice begins when everyone else finally has a chance to win. Almost a year has passed since Sandra walked into that warehouse break room carrying divorce papers and believing she was leaving behind an ordinary man with an ordinary future. Looking back now, I sometimes wonder how differently everything might have unfolded if Raymond's letter had arrived 1 week earlier or 1 week later. Perhaps Sandra would have made a different decision. Perhaps Craig would have hidden his mistakes more carefully. But then I remind myself that timing never creates character. It only reveals it. Every choice they made came before they knew I owned the company. That truth has always mattered far more to me than the inheritance itself. People often ask what it feels like to go from unloading freight trucks to leading a corporation worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The honest answer usually disappoints them. I still wake up before sunrise. I still drink black coffee from the same chipped mug I've owned for years. I still drive the same pickup truck to work because it runs perfectly well. And I still spend more time walking through warehouses than sitting behind a polished executive desk. Money changed my responsibilities, but it never changed who I wanted to be. The greatest lesson Raymond left me wasn't written in his will. It was hidden inside the way he built his company. Gerald later showed me a handwritten note Raymond had placed with the estate documents shortly before he died. It contained only one sentence. Never trust a leader who forgets the people wearing work boots. I framed those words and hung them in my office where I see them every morning before making a single decision. They remind me where I came from and who this company truly belongs to. Pete Akers was promoted to Regional Safety Director 6 months after the investigation ended. The maintenance supervisor who kept warning everyone about dangerous equipment now oversees safety standards across every warehouse we own. Several young employees who had nearly resigned because they believed hard work no longer mattered are now department managers. Watching them succeed has brought me far more satisfaction than seeing Craig lose his title ever could. I heard only one final piece of news about Sandra. She wrote me a letter shortly before Christmas. It wasn't a request for money or another chance. It was simply an apology. She admitted she had mistaken stability for failure and excitement for success. She thanked me for never speaking badly about her in public, despite everything that had happened. I read the letter once, folded it carefully, and placed it inside a drawer. I never answered it. Not because I hated her, but because some chapters deserve a quiet ending instead of one more conversation. Forgiveness doesn't always require reconciliation. Sometimes it simply means refusing to carry bitterness into tomorrow. Every Friday afternoon I still walk through the warehouse where my story changed forever. The old break room has been completely renovated. New tables replace the worn plastic ones. The broken vending machine is long gone. Most of the newer employees have no idea that the quiet man greeting them each week once stood in that very room signing divorce papers while his own boss smiled in the background. And that's perfectly fine with me. Titles fade. Headlines disappear. Wealth comes and goes. But character has a way of revealing itself when nobody expects it. Craig believed power came from humiliating people who couldn't fight back. Sandra believed happiness could be found by following whoever seemed strongest at the moment. Both of them lost everything because they built their futures on appearances instead of principles. I inherited a fortune I never expected. But the greatest gift Raymond ever gave me wasn't measured in dollars. He gave me the opportunity to prove that integrity will always outlast deception, patience will always outlast arrogance, and quiet dignity will always be stronger than loud revenge. If my story leaves you with one lesson, let it be this. Never measure a person's worth by the job they have today, because tomorrow they may be the one holding the door you desperately hope will still open. And sometimes the greatest victory isn't watching those who betrayed you fall. It's building a life so honest and meaningful that their betrayal no longer has the power to define your future.